She had billions in the bank and the world at her fingertips, but when disaster struck, the men in luxury suits just watched. It was the poorest man in the room who gave her the one thing money couldn't buy. What he did next changed both of their lives forever. The midday sun hammered down on the sprawling, manicured grounds of the Azure Cove Resort, turning the azure water of the infinity pool into a blinding sheet of crushed diamonds. For the executives of Ascendancy Tech, this annual retreat was a lavish playground of bottomless mimosas, whispered mergers, and sun-drenched indulgence. But for 34-year-old Wyatt Miller, it was nothing more than a grueling high-stakes battlefield of tangled cables and unforgiving deadlines. Wyatt was a senior audiovisual technician, a man whose entire professional existence was predicated on remaining utterly invisible. Dressed in a sweat-dampened black polo shirt that felt like an oven in the tropical heat, he knelt behind the lavish poolside cabanas, desperately trying to route a stubborn XLR cable for the afternoon's keynote address. Every drop of sweat, every hour of soul-crushing overtime spent away from his cramped apartment had a singular beating purpose: his 7-year-old son, Sam. Sam's birthday was exactly 2 weeks away, and the vintage blue bicycle sitting in the window of the local pawn shop wasn't going to buy itself. Wyatt didn't care about the wealth surrounding him. His riches were waiting at home. Just a few yards away, cutting through the crystalline water of the lap pool with fierce, methodical strokes, was Caroline Brooks. As the CEO and founder of Ascendancy Tech, Caroline was a force of nature, a woman who had clawed her way to the top of a male-dominated industry with a reputation for being as brilliant as she was ruthless. In the boardroom, she was a titan, commanding a billion-dollar empire with an iron grip and an icy detachment. But that immense power came at a profound emotional cost. She was surrounded by yes-men, sycophants, and opportunistic predators constantly circling for a moment of weakness. She trusted absolutely no one. Swimming was her solitary sanctuary, the only hour of the day where the suffocating weight of her empire couldn't reach her, the only place where she didn't have to wear her invisible armor. As Wyatt finally clicked the heavy metal connector of the speaker cable into place, a sharp, distinct snap echoed over the ambient hum of the resort, immediately followed by a sudden, violent splash and a sharp intake of breath. He turned his head instinctively toward the sound. Caroline had abruptly halted in the shallow end of the pool, her arms flying up to cross frantically over her chest. The intricate, jeweled clasp of her designer halter swimsuit had given way completely beneath the strain of her swimming. For a horrifying fraction of a second, absolute panic flared in Caroline's normally unflappable eyes. She was exposed, terrified, and utterly vulnerable. The resort patio, normally buzzing with relaxed conversation, fell into a sudden, suffocating hush. A group of wealthy venture capitalists lounging nearby paused with their crystal tumblers halfway to their mouths. Some averted their eyes awkwardly, but others, the very men she commanded and enriched, lingered, a distinct smirk playing on their lips, eager to witness the unflappable ice queen of Ascendancy Tech finally humiliated. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He didn't gawk, he didn't laugh, and he didn't freeze. The instinct born of a lifetime of quiet decency overrode any spectator curiosity. In a fluid, immediate motion, he spun completely on his heel, turning his broad back entirely to the pool and the exposed CEO. Without a single word, he reached out, grabbed a massive, plush white towel from the stack resting on the cabana counter, and extended his arm blindly backward into the empty air behind him. "Take your time." "Ma'am," Wyatt said, his voice projecting a calm, steady timbre that sliced through the silent, toxic tension of the patio. He kept his gaze locked fiercely on the distant line of palm trees swaying against the horizon. "I've got my eyes on the horizon." Caroline, her heart pounding frantically against her ribs, swam quickly to the tiled edge. She snatched the thick terry-cloth towel from his outstretched hand, wrapping it tightly around her trembling shoulders. As she secured the fabric, she stared up at his back. The utter lack of hesitation in his response, the unrehearsed, absolute respect of his deliberately averted gaze, struck her like a physical blow. In a world where every man she knew would have exploited her vulnerability for leverage or cheap amusement, this invisible working-class father had instinctively stepped up to become her shield. Later that evening, the resort's grand ballroom was utterly transformed from a breezy tropical haven into a suffocating theater of corporate ambition. beneath the warm golden glow of thousands of crystal chandeliers. The space was flooded with the clinking of champagne flutes, the rustle of expensive silk and the hollow, calculated laughter of ascendancy tech's elite. Caroline stood near the center of the room, looking breathtaking and untouchable in a floor-length emerald gown that caught the ambient light with every subtle movement. To the untrained eye, she was the undisputed queen of the room, holding court among the industry's most powerful investors and aggressive venture capitalists. Yet behind her polite, painted smile, she felt entirely isolated. The men swarming around her weren't seeing a person. They were seeing a walking, talking profit margin, a human stepping stone to their next massive bonus. Every compliment felt like a transaction. Every handshake felt like a hidden threat. As a boastful executive droned on about his latest offshore acquisition, Caroline's gaze drifted past the sea of tailored tuxedos and glittering jewelry, piercing through the superficial glamour until it landed on the dim, unglamorous corner of the ballroom. There, standing quietly behind a massive, blinking soundboard, was Wyatt, stripped of his sweaty polo shirt and now dressed in a modest, slightly worn black suit that had clearly seen better days. He was diligently monitoring the wireless microphone frequencies for the upcoming keynote speeches. He was the invisible pulse of the entire event, ensuring the voices of the powerful carried across the room, all while remaining completely unseen himself. Caroline watched him adjust a fader, his expression focused and entirely unbothered by the exorbitant wealth flaunted just feet away from him. The jarring contrast between the ravenous greed of her inner circle and the quiet, unshakable dignity Wyatt had displayed by the pool earlier that afternoon echoed loudly in her mind. In a room overflowing with millionaires, the technician in the cheap suit was the only man she genuinely respected. Unable to stomach another second of hollow corporate flattery, Caroline murmured a polite but firm excuse to the stunned investor mid-sentence and navigated her way through the crowded floor. As she approached the tech station, the heavy scent of expensive cologne faded, replaced by the faint, honest smell of ozone and hot electronics. Wyatt looked up from his glowing monitors, slightly startled as the CEO of the company suddenly stepped into the shadowed alcove of his workspace. He immediately straightened his posture, offering a respectful, professional nod. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice keeping the same calm, steady timbre she remembered from the pool. "Is there an issue with the audio? I can adjust the monitors if the feedback is too harsh." "No, Wyatt," Caroline replied softly, a rare, genuinely warm smile breaking through her normally icy exterior. "The audio is flawless. I came over here because I needed to thank you properly for earlier today. You handled an incredibly awkward, vulnerable situation with remarkable grace. Most of the men in this room would have stared, or worse, they would have used the embarrassment to diminish me. You didn't even hesitate to look away." Wyatt offered a small, self-deprecating shrug, his hands resting gently on the edge of the soundboard. "It was nothing, ma'am, honestly. It was just basic decency." "You don't owe me a thank you for treating you like a human being." Caroline leaned slightly against the table, the heavy, invisible armor she wore every single day beginning to crack in the face of his absolute sincerity. "In my world, basic decency is the rarest and most expensive commodity there is." "Where does a reflex like that come from?" Wyatt paused, his eyes softening as a deeply fond expression washed over his face. "I'm a single dad, Ms. Brooks. I have a 7-year-old boy named Sam waiting for me back in my apartment. Every single day, I'm trying to teach him what it actually means to be a good man in a world that often rewards the opposite. I always tell him that true character isn't about the grand, heroic gestures you make when the spotlight is on you and everyone is clapping. Character is strictly about what you do in that split second when you think absolutely nobody is watching. If I can't live by that rule myself, especially when it matters, then I have no right to teach it to my son." Caroline stood in stunned silence, the bustling, deafening noise of the gala seeming to completely fade away into nothingness. She had spent her entire life meticulously analyzing people's hidden motives, perpetually waiting for the catch, the angle, the hidden agenda. Looking into Wyatt's honest eyes, she saw absolutely none of that. She saw a man whose integrity was marrow-deep, a man who possessed a quiet, unshakable wealth that her billions could never buy. The intoxicating warmth and unexpected human connection of the previous evening evaporated the moment Caroline Brooks stepped into the frosty, hyper-modern executive boardroom the following morning. The room, walled entirely in soundproof glass overlooking the churning ocean, was meant to be a quiet sanctuary for her final keynote preparations. Instead, it felt like a beautifully designed execution chamber. Sitting in stony silence around the long obsidian conference table were the 7 principal members of her executive board, led by her fiercely ambitious vice president, Richard Vance. Richard was a man Caroline had personally mentored, plucking him from a stagnant mid-level management role and molding him into a titan of industry. But as she took her seat at the head of the table, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense, heavy with unspoken malice. No one offered the usual morning pleasantries. No one even dared to meet her eye. Richard slowly stood up, meticulously smoothing the lapels of his bespoke suit, and placed a thick, legal-bound folder onto the polished black glass. With a voice dripping in calculated faux sympathy, he announced that the board had convened a secret shadow vote late last night while she was at the gala. Citing a highly obscure, deeply buried clause in the company's foundational bylaws regarding leadership stability and market confidence, they were officially invoking a hostile vote of no confidence. Their goal was to legally strip her of her title as CEO, effectively stealing the company she had built. Effective immediately following the morning session, Caroline sat utterly frozen, the blood rapidly draining from her face as the sheer, devastating scale of the betrayal washed over her. This wasn't a sudden disagreement over quarterly margins. This was a meticulously engineered corporate coup, likely months in the making, executed flawlessly by the very people whose immense fortunes she had built from the ground up. She looked around the long table, her eyes darting from face to face, desperately searching for a single dissenting expression, a single shred of loyalty or hesitation. But the men and women she had trusted with her empire simply stared back with cold, avaricious calculation. They wanted the limitless power of ascendancy tech, and they wanted it without her casting a shadow over them. Refusing to let them see her break, Caroline stood tall, her voice slicing through the stifling room like a steel blade. She calmly informed them that she still had the morning keynote, and during that globally broadcast address, she intended to present the unassailable fourth-quarter projections and the finalized offshore merger documents that would legally invalidate their ridiculous, desperate coup. But Richard merely offered a predatory, pitying smile. He tapped a single button on his encrypted tablet, and the massive presentation screen behind him instantly flashed bright red with a glaring, access denied error code. The board had quietly locked her out of the entire Ascendancy Tech mainframe. Her encrypted drives, her presentations, her unassailable defense, everything was gone, walled off behind a master administrative firewall she could no longer breach. Panic, sharp, bitter, and entirely unfamiliar, finally clawed at Caroline's throat. She was entirely defenseless. They hadn't just ambushed her in the boardroom. They had systematically stripped her of her weapons right before pushing her out onto the battlefield. Without that critical data, her highly anticipated keynote would be a hollow, rambling failure, publicly cementing Richard's manufactured narrative that she was erratic and unfit to lead. She turned on her heel and marched out of the boardroom without another word, her fiercely composed exterior masking the terrifying freefall happening inside her mind. Retreating to the empty, dimly lit hallway behind the main auditorium stage, she leaned heavily against the cool concrete wall, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. In a global company of over 10,000 employees, the most powerful woman in the tech industry didn't have a single ally she could call. She was surrounded by vipers in $1,000 suits, all eagerly waiting for her to publicly bleed out. She desperately needed someone who could bypass a closed-loop network, someone with elite technical access who operated completely outside the toxic, treacherous hierarchy of the executive board. Above all, she needed someone who absolutely could not be bought, someone whose loyalty to basic decency outweighed their greed. The vivid memory of the previous night, of a man who shielded her dignity without asking for a dime, a man who taught his son that character wasn't for sale, suddenly blazed to life in her mind. She didn't need a corporate lawyer or another ambitious executive. She needed Wyatt Miller. Caroline hurried through the labyrinthine service corridors of the Azure Cove Resort, her heels clicking frantically against the polished concrete. She found Wyatt Miller in the cavernous, empty auditorium, methodically coiling thick black XLR cables into perfect figure eights. He looked up, surprised by the sudden intrusion of the CEO into his utilitarian domain. The meticulously crafted mask of unbothered authority Caroline usually wore was completely shattered, replaced by the raw, unvarnished desperation of a woman cornered. Stripped of her pride, she quickly outlined the devastating boardroom coup, explaining how Richard Vance had weaponized the company's network to lock her out of the presentation mainframe. She didn't need an executive. She needed an untraceable backdoor into the system. Wyatt, pausing his work, listened intently. He understood the monumental risk. Helping her meant crossing the very men who signed his paychecks. But he also recognized the profound injustice of the ambush. Without a word of hesitation, he dropped the cables, pulled his heavily modified diagnostic laptop from his weathered backpack, and began furiously typing, utilizing the resort's localized AV network to build a stealth bridge into the Ascendancy servers. As the complex decryption protocols ran on Wyatt's screen, Caroline was momentarily pulled away by an urgent phone call from her legal counsel, leaving Wyatt alone in the dim glow of his monitors. It was in this quiet vulnerability that Richard Vance struck. The vice president slinked out from the shadows of the stage curtains, his bespoke Italian suit contrasting sharply with the dusty backstage environment. Richard had been monitoring the network anomalies and tracked the bypass attempt directly to the AV station. He didn't come with threats. He came with a far more insidious weapon. Slipping a thick, heavy manila envelope from his jacket, Richard tossed it onto the soundboard right next to Wyatt's keyboard. The flap fell open, revealing thick, crisp stacks of $100 bills. $50,000 in untraceable cash. Richard leaned in close, the sickeningly sweet smell of his expensive cologne invading Wyatt's space. With a voice like oiled silk, Richard explained that all Wyatt had to do was close his laptop, walk away, and let the keynote presentation crash. The money was his, free and clear, more money than the technician made in an entire year of grueling overtime. Wyatt stared down at the stacks of cash. $50,000. It wasn't just a number. It was a completely different life. It was a reliable car that wouldn't stall in the winter. It was a safe apartment in a neighborhood where his son could actually play outside without worry. It was not just the vintage blue bicycle for Sam's birthday, but the beginning of a college fund to ensure the boy never had to break his back coiling cables for ungrateful billionaires. It was the ultimate, tantalizing escape hatch from a life of crushing financial anxiety. Richard watched the technician's eyes lock onto the money, a smug, predatory smirk spreading across his face as he waited for the inevitable capitulation. In Richard's world, every single person had a price, and $50,000 was more than enough to buy the soul of a desperate, invisible worker. He placed a patronizing hand on Wyatt's shoulder, whispering that it was just business, and that Wyatt owed nothing to a sinking ship like Caroline Brooks. Wyatt slowly reached out, his calloused fingers brushing against the rough paper of the envelope. He thought of Sam's bright, trusting eyes. He remembered the conversation he had with Caroline just hours before, the promise he made to himself about the lessons he imparted to his boy. Slowly, Wyatt picked up the heavy envelope, weighed it in his hands for a fraction of a second, and then firmly pressed it back into the center of Richard Vance's pristine chest. I told Ms. Brooks last night that I teach my son that true character is what you do when nobody is watching, Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a low, unshakable register that echoed with absolute authority. I also teach him that character isn't for sale. Not for 50,000, not for 50 million. Take your money, Mr. Vance, my screen stays on. He turned his back on the stunned vice president, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he smashed the final firewall, a resounding access granted illuminating his face in triumphant green light. With exactly 2 minutes until the global broadcast went live, Caroline sprinted back into the shadowed alcove of the sound booth, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She arrived just in time to see Richard Vance violently shoving his way out of the backstage exit, his face a mask of twisted rage, clutching a thick manila envelope. She didn't need to ask what had just transpired. The heavy, toxic tension in the air and the unyielding, iron-set posture of Wyatt Miller told her everything. Wyatt simply hit the enter key one final time, and a crisp green progress bar zipped across his diagnostic screen. "You're in, Ms. Brooks," Wyatt said quietly, pulling a sleek silver flash drive from the side of the console and handing it to her. Every file, every projection, every piece of data they tried to bury, it's completely unencrypted and routed directly to your clicker. They have no control over the main screen anymore. Caroline took the drive, her fingers lingering briefly over his calloused hand. She wanted to say 1,000 things, to apologize for Richard's foul behavior, to express a gratitude deeper than words, but the stage manager was frantically gesturing from the wings. She gave Wyatt one final, profound nod of respect, turned on her heel, and walked out into the blinding high-wattage glare of the auditorium stage. The applause from the thousands of shareholders and international press members was deafening, but as Caroline took her place behind the lucite podium, her eyes locked instantly onto the front row. Richard Vance and the treacherous executive board sat perfectly aligned, their faces arranged in identical masks of polite, predatory expectation. They were waiting for the catastrophe, waiting for her to click to the first slide and panic as the access-denied screen broadcast her failure to the entire world. Caroline took a slow, deep breath, centering herself. She didn't just feel the weight of her billion-dollar empire. She felt the quiet, unshakable strength of the invisible man operating the soundboard behind the curtain. With a voice that rang out like struck crystal, clear and utterly commanding, she welcomed the audience and seamlessly pressed the button on her remote. Behind her, the massive LED screen didn't flash red. Instead, it ignited with brilliant, high-resolution graphics, instantly displaying the unassailable fourth quarter, projections and the meticulously finalized, offshore merger documents that the board had desperately tried to hide. A collective gasp rippled through the front row. Richard Vance's smug composure shattered instantly, his face draining of all color as he stared up at the impossible data. But Caroline wasn't finished. Wyatt hadn't just bypassed the firewall. His deep dive into the network had inadvertently scraped the local server's cache, pulling up the undeniable, time-stamped digital footprint of the board's illegal shadow vote and their orchestrated attempt to sabotage the presentation. With a flick of her wrist, Caroline transitioned the slide, broadcasting the raw, encrypted emails and internal memos of the coup directly to the thousands of stakeholders in the room. The auditorium fell into a stunned, breathless silence as the sheer magnitude of the betrayal was laid bare in 60-foot letters. Caroline's voice never wavered as she systematically dismantled their conspiracy live on stage, legally invalidating their shadow vote and exposing their actions as a direct, actionable breach of fiduciary duty. The silence suddenly broke, replaced by an uproar of outrage from the principal shareholders. Pandemonium erupted as investors demanded immediate answers. Realizing his entire career and freedom were evaporating in real time, Richard Vance stood up, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly before he quickly turned and scrambled toward the side exit, followed closely by the disgraced board members. Security intercepted them before they could reach the doors. Standing victorious amidst the absolute chaos, Caroline had not only saved her company, she had permanently excised the rot from within it. As a thunderous standing ovation finally swelled through the cavernous room, washing over the stage in waves of validation, Caroline felt a profound sense of triumph. Yet, as she looked up from the cheering crowd and peered into the dim shadows of the sound booth at the back of the auditorium, her smile softened. There was no victory lap for Wyatt Miller. The monitors were already powered down. He was quietly rolling up his final XLR cable, slinging his heavy, weathered backpack over his shoulder, and slipping silently out the back door, returning to his invisible world, eager simply to go home to his son. The morning sun struggled to filter through the dusty, slanted blinds of Wyatt Miller's cramped two-bedroom apartment, casting long, pale shadows across the scuffed linoleum floor. The air was thick with the comforting domestic smell of melting butter and boxed pancake batter. Standing over a sputtering electric stove, Wyatt flipped a slightly misshapen pancake, the profound exhaustion of the previous 72 hours settling deep into his bones. His cheap suit was crumpled in the laundry basket, and the glamorous high-stakes world of the Azure Cove Resort felt like a fever dream from a lifetime ago. At the small, wobbly kitchen table sat his 7-year-old son Sam, happily coloring a picture of a superhero. Wyatt watched him for a moment, a quiet, profound peace washing over his lingering fatigue. He didn't have $50,000 hidden in a manila envelope. He was still worried about the upcoming rent, and he still wasn't entirely sure how he was going to afford the vintage blue bicycle sitting in the window of the local pawn shop before Sam's birthday next week. But as he looked at his son, Wyatt knew his conscience was entirely clean. He had passed the hardest test of his life, proving that the lessons he taught Sam were not just empty words. The quiet morning routine was abruptly broken by a firm, deliberate knock at the front door. Wyatt frowned, wiping his flour-dusted hands on a dish towel. He wasn't expecting anyone, certainly not on a Sunday morning. He unbolted the lock and pulled the creaking door open, fully expecting to see his landlord holding a clipboard. Instead, standing in the dingy, fluorescent-lit hallway of his apartment complex, was Caroline Brooks. The icy, untouchable CEO of Ascendancy Tech was completely gone. In her place stood a woman dressed in a simple cashmere sweater and dark jeans, her posture relaxed and her eyes radiating a warm, genuine brilliance. Behind her, dominating the narrow walkway, was a stunning, brand-new vintage-style blue bicycle, its chrome handlebars gleaming under the flickering hallway lights. Wyatt stood frozen in the doorway, utterly speechless. Sam, peeking around his father's legs, let out a loud, breathless gasp, his eyes going wide as saucers at the sight of the bike. Caroline smiled, stepping aside to let the boy fully take in the gift. "I noticed you checking the prices on kids' bikes on your phone browser during the sound check yesterday morning," Caroline explained gently, her voice carrying none of the boardroom command, only a profound gratitude. "I know his birthday is coming up. I thought this might save you a trip. Ms. Brooks, You didn't have to do this," Wyatt finally managed to say, completely overwhelmed as Sam rushed forward to trace his little fingers over the glossy blue paint. "May I come in?" she asked. Wyatt quickly stepped aside, apologizing for the mess as he cleared a stack of mail from the only armchair in the living room. Caroline didn't sit. She turned to face him, her expression turning serious, carrying the immense gravity of the woman who had just conquered a corporate empire. "I had security sweep the backstage area after the presentation," she said quietly. "They found Richard Vance's envelope on the floor near the exit. And they pulled the audio logs from the security cameras in the hallway. I heard the conversation, Wyatt. I heard what he offered you. $50,000 to let me burn. And I heard you throw it right back in his face." Wyatt swallowed hard, looking down at his worn boots. "Like I said, Ms. Brooks, character isn't for sale." "I know," Caroline replied, taking a step closer. "Yesterday I stood in a room full of the wealthiest, most highly educated executives in the country, and every single one of them was a coward and a thief. My company doesn't lack capital, Wyatt. It lacks a soul. I spent the entire night restructuring the executive board, and I am launching a massive, newly funded community outreach and philanthropic division for Ascendancy Tech. We are going to start giving back, building up the communities we operate in." She paused, her eyes locking onto his with absolute certainty. "I need someone to run it. I need a director of operations who understands what it means to struggle, someone whose integrity is absolutely unshakable. The starting salary is $300,000 a year, complete with a full executive benefits package and a college trust for Sam." Wyatt's breath caught in his throat, the sheer magnitude of the offer completely knocking the wind out of him. He looked at Caroline, then over to his son, who was happily ringing the shiny silver bell on the handlebars of his new bike. In a single terrifying moment of vulnerability by a swimming pool, Wyatt had instinctively chosen basic human decency. In a dark auditorium, he had chosen honor over an easy fortune. He had done the right thing when he thought nobody was watching, never expecting a reward. But as Caroline extended her hand to finalize the offer, Wyatt realized that the universe had been watching all along, and the quiet, invisible integrity he had guarded so fiercely had just changed his and his son's destiny forever.